Welcome to our part 2 of study skills, spaced repetition and interleaving. Much like Caddyshack 2, this is, I'm sure, highly anticipated and sure to disappoint. Actually, I think this is a good one too. These are great skills to pick up and that you can use them for in so many different contexts. Just great. So, here we go. All right, let's jump into it. Here we are. We're going to talk about spaced repetition. Okay, here I'm going to provide a definition of spaced repetition and give you an example of what it can look like in actual practice and study practice. So you could think of it as spreading information retrieval out over larger and larger time increments. Over larger and larger time increments instead of cramming. And the cramming can be early or late. Both are detrimental to your recollection on the exam. In other words, if you cram late, everybody understands that concept. You try and jam the whole semester in the last 3 days before an exam, pray you remember everything, go home twitching from all of the caffeine, and not sleep for 3 days. But cramming at the beginning can look like you're doing a really good job because you're outlining after every class. But if you don't return to that week 2 material until week 12, you're still going to have a problem with recall. It's just natural. And I'll show you a graph that's one of the classic graphs of forgetting. So what it looks like in practice can be something like this. You go, so review a concept a few hours after class, perhaps outline at that point, and then you retrieve that information a week later. And by retrieve, I mean insofar as it's relevant, you can use the retrieval practice forced recall strategy, or you retrieve it through doing an IRAC, or you can retrieve it by reviewing your notes. It's not as engaging, but the important thing here is that you engage the material at some level, preferably more substantively. But anyway, you do it a week later, and then 2 weeks later, and then 4 weeks later. And what that does is it makes the memory more robust in your mind. I'll show you what I mean in a couple of graphs. Yeah, so here's the whole thing I was talking about before. Here's something that you learned in first semester torts. And the day you learn it, you have 100% retention of that material. Well, as everything went on during the last semester, there's an election, or is there one? And then there was one, and everybody gets distracted. Your retention, if we're tested at any point during that time, would be close to baseline, which is about 10%. And then as you start to study, that recollection recovers the baseline very slowly. This is the scenario where I say that where I mentioned earlier, where you practice that stuff right after class and then don't touch it in a week, very late in the semester. You run into a problem. You just run out of real estate, run out of time, and gray matter real estate for retaining this information at that point. Here's a graphic illustration, literally, of how spaced repetition improves retention and recall. So the blue line is the classic forgetting curve as identified by Ebbinghaus in the 1800s. For those of you who are psychology majors, you remember him. So if you review that material right after class, about 10 minutes or whenever, right after class, you then have 100% retention for that time that you're doing it. And and if you never come back to it, it similarly will be decaying away close to baseline. But if you then do it a day later, a week later, or a month later, and this could be, you could substitute your own scale. I usually go with the 1-2-5 spacing. So, 1 week, 2 weeks, 4 or 5 weeks, depending on how your schedule looks. And anyway, if you repeatedly expose yourself to that information after the initial learning, you improve your recall dramatically by the time the semester is over. You see the difference between the light blue and the dark blue is the degree of recollection, comparing if you do absolutely nothing at all compared to if you revisit these materials repeatedly throughout the semester. It's not too late to do this at all. These benefits can be seen almost immediately when you start implementing it. Just when you look at these curves, there's a certain amount of residual retention that you have, and that is, you'll show that immediately upon when you start to employ this technique. So let's talk about how you can implement spaced repetition in your study plan. And I imagine you may be thinking, bleh, another piece of BS that I have to actually implement on top of all the other BS that I'm doing this semester. No, it's not going to be that kind of problem. Here's the situation. What you can do is integrate spaced repetition into your study plan almost seamlessly. The first thing you do is you start outlining every week on a weekly basis. Maybe make the first part of your studying on Saturday, if that's how you do it, or the first part of your studying for the week is outlining that previous week's worth of material. And that way you stay up to date on your outline, and guess what? You already achieved the first re-exposure to that material after your outline. Then you can work it in a little bit differently later on. If you have flashcards, and you say you divide them by week or combine some earlier covered materials, then you just go back and revisit only those flashcards or interleave those different types of flashcards with each other to keep yourself on your toes. You can quiz yourself and your study partners on previously covered materials. Just say, hey, what do you remember how this works? And then talk it through. That counts, and that's an easy way of revisiting the material. You can also complete or even redo practice materials. Surprisingly, redoing a practice question allows you to reemphasize the organization that you had in that original question and maybe improve upon it, get you more comfortable, see if you still remember those rules, see if you are still able to conduct the analysis, or if you do it better now. So those are all good reasons to redo practice questions. And you could also do it at irregular intervals, right? By that I mean, all right, you mix in a different week every week. So let's say week 6 of a semester, you can work in week 1 flashcards, and if you're working with your study group, go back and just touch on that section of the law to see if you have any, just revisit it and see if you have any questions so you can talk about with each other. But you can plan those out really straightforwardly. You could start with less space in between each repetition and then move to more space between each repetition. Again, I'm not sure what the actual optimal spacing is, but I usually do 1-2-5. Like, I do 1-2-5, 10, 20, 50, etc. So that's how I implement it myself. Next concept I wanted to talk about is interleaving. Here's same kind of formulation for interleaving. What is it? It's the switching between topics rather than focusing on a single concept for an extended period of time. We all know burnout happens. It's legit. It's real. We're all in the midst of it hardcore right now. However, you can still mitigate the effects of burnout within a studying session to maintain something more akin to efficiency. And that is by switching topics within a multi-hour study session every 2-3 hours. Depending on where you are in your study day, it could differ. But here's where you also can connect similar skills in different topics. I'll talk about that second. So I would suggest choosing 2 to 3 topics daily for a study session instead of one topic. And the reason for that is if you study the same topic all day, your brain will just shut off. It'll stop processing information. You'll gloss over important differences. You won't see anything like those differences in front of you. You'll just see stuff you, quote, already know. And that's because your brain is just glossing over information it finds boring, I think. But what the better way of addressing that is for after a couple of hours of doing tours, take a break, go back in, do a couple hours of property, take a break, go back in, do a couple, 3, whatever hours, probably lesser towards the end of the day, not probably better to be longer sessions at the beginning of the day when you're still fresh, but you get the idea. You want to mix things up because that permits you to stay fresher. And it also permits you to take advantage of the second bullet point on the left, which is connecting similar skills on different topics. If you practice Iraqs in one area, then in turn practice Iraqs in a different area, there will be overlap. And that is true even if the professor calls for a slightly different format. Because when it comes down to it, the format is simply change in format is a different vehicle for providing evidence of how you can through which you can demonstrate that you know how the law works. So if you think of it that way, there is great transference of the skills you learn from one Iraq to the other, be it finding the most comfortable transition language, be it when is the best time to write your issue statement, at the beginning of when you're writing or at the end. There are different schools of thought. However, you have time to test that out because you can do the same thing in torts as you can in property, right? So it's connecting those similar skills and different topics really can be a beneficial endeavor. You do want to spend an adequate amount of time in each topic, I guess. That almost goes without saying. It almost did go without me saying it. I nearly clicked through. But, I think 2 to 3 topics rather than all 5 or 6 one day is much preferable. So here's a couple ways of including interleaving in your study plan. Include multiple topics in your study time instead of just one. Practice similar skills in various topics in different classes. Yep. For example, outline torts, then outline contracts, or complete practice questions in Civ Pro, then property, then contracts. Make sure you don't just do one question. Do a couple questions, then a couple questions, then a couple questions. Make sure you engage with the material as you do it.